Hi, my name is John Whittaker, and in addition to being a regular contributor for Renew, I am the creator of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament, where I provide clear, down-to-earth teaching straight through the books of the New Testament. I've been asked to review a brand new book by Richard Hays. And if you're not familiar with the name Richard Hays, he's been a respected New Testament scholar for 4 decades. He's written numerous books and articles, and he's just released a brand new book entitled The Widening of God's Mercy, Sexuality Within the Biblical Story. And this new book actually comes with an awful lot of anticipation because it represents a real change of heart on Richard's part about same-sex relationships and same-sex marriage within the church. In 1996, Richard wrote a book entitled The Moral Vision of the New Testament. And in that book, he had a chapter that wrestled with the particularly New Testament data about same-sex attraction, same-sex behavior. And he concluded in that book in 1996 that the New Testament prohibits same-sex behavior for the church. Well, this new book really represents a significant change of heart. And it really raises the question, what new data led Richard, along with his son, who he wrote this with, to revise his position, to change how he thought? And just to state their position up front, the concluding chapter to this new book is actually entitled Moral Revision. You can hear that it's playing off of the title of his 1996 book. And here's the conclusion as they state it in the concluding chapter to this book. They say, to say it one more time, our vision is this. The biblical narratives throughout the Old Testament and New trace a trajectory of mercy that leads us to welcome sexual minorities no longer as strangers and aliens, but as fellow citizens with the saints and also members of the household of God. Full stop. You can find that quote on page 207 of this new book. And by welcome, when they say to welcome sexual minorities, they don't just mean being kind, hospitable, gracious, loving. They mean fully affirming same-sex sexual relationships and marriage. So let me give a little bit of a summary of the book, and then we'll look at exactly what the book is so you know what you're getting. And then I'll give a key strength and some weaknesses from this book. So by way of summary, here's how the book is laid out. There's an initial introductory chapter written by both Richard and Christopher that lays out sort of their plan and their attack and really states up front, it shows their cards, states up front what they believe so that we at least know where they're going. Then after that introductory chapter, there's 7 chapters by Christopher Hays, Richard's son. Christopher Hays is an Old Testament professor at Fuller Theological Seminary, and he surveys in those 7 chapters the story of the Old Testament, really with the aim of showing that God's mercy is wider than often assumed. And his main point is that throughout the Old Testament, God frequently changes his mind, and when he does so, it's usually in the direction of mercy. So according to Christopher, this includes changing his mind, say, about the laws he instituted, changing his mind about whether he should punish disobedience in certain cases, changing his mind about who he includes among his people. So that's chapters 1 through 7. And then chapters 8 through 16, Richard writes, and his focus is on the New Testament. And he surveys some passages out of the Gospels, out of Acts, and gives kind of an overview of the book of Romans. So he shows how God's mercy played out in Jesus' ministry by Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners. Then he explores the expansion of God's mercy in the book of Acts through welcoming eunuchs and Gentiles. And then finally, he explores the book of Romans and really kind of gives a quick overview of the whole book of Romans and then zeroes in on Romans chapter 14 to make the point that just as Paul exhorted the strong and the weak in Romans 14 to welcome each other in spite of differences of opinions about food and drink, well, the church today needs to do the same thing when it comes to differences of opinions about sexual morality. And then both Christopher and Richard come back together, collaborate on the concluding chapter where they state their conclusion of that biblical survey, specifically with regards to same-sex relationships and marriage within the church today. And then there's a little epilogue at the end of the book by Richard, which essentially amounts to a personal confession by Richard for all the harm he caused by writing the chapter on homosexuality in his 1996 book, Moral Vision of the New Testament. Now, before we consider some strengths and weaknesses of this book, I think it's helpful for me to point out what exactly you're getting in this book. So if you buy this book and you're expecting a fresh look at the biblical passages regarding same-sex behavior or an exploration of the Bible's teaching concerning the nature of marriage, you're going to be disappointed. The authors don't actually engage a single biblical text about marriage and sexuality. They do mention the brief idea of porneia, sexual immorality, in Acts 15 when they're surveying Acts 15. But other than that, there's no other text that's mentioned about marriage and sexuality. And to me, that seems like a pretty huge omission for a book that's supposed to be about sexuality in the biblical story. If you're hoping maybe for some new data or a fresh examination of biblical texts to help you understand how they reached their conclusion that same-sex sexual relationships in marriage should no longer be seen as contrary to God's will, well, you're going to be sorely disappointed because they offer no argumentation for that position. I'll actually talk about that more in just a little bit. The essential message of this book is that God regularly changes his mind, specifically about who should be included among his people. And since he decides that Gentiles and eunuchs should be included, and the reason eunuchs come up is because they're mentioned in Deuteronomy 23, they're mentioned in Isaiah 56, and then what happens in Acts chapter 8. So they mention the eunuchs, and since God decides to include Gentiles and eunuchs, well, guess what? Sex difference, that means male and female no longer matters in marriage, and we should fully include sexual minorities, specifically same-sex couples within the church today. So let's talk about some strengths and weaknesses. I really see one key strength of this book, and that is that both Christopher and Richard exhibit a deep concern for the well-being of LGBTQ people. They express deep sorrow over the harm that has been experienced by same-sex couples and members of the LGBT community, specifically by how they've been treated at times by the church. And it's that concern that motivated them to write this book. So while I believe their argument, if you want to call it that, and the conclusion they draw is deeply flawed from a biblical perspective, I think that motivation is good, and we at least need to acknowledge that. All of us who want to honor Jesus must examine ourselves and make sure that we treat LGBTQ people with the same kind of love and the same kind of hospitality that Jesus has shown us. Now, beyond that strength, there's a number of weaknesses. This book is fraught with logical, exegetical, and theological problems. So I'm just going to highlight a few for us. The first one is this. They assume their conclusion. For 2,000 years, the historic, global, multi-ethnic church has spoken with one voice on the matter of same-sex behavior. The unanimous conclusion of the church has been that sex difference is an essential part of marriage, and that therefore same-sex behavior is contrary to God's will. And yet, as I noted just a moment ago, both Christopher Hayes and Richard Hayes offer no argument to overturn that unanimous voice of the church. Without offering any substantive reasoning or evidence, they reject the church's long-standing and historic consensus. They simply assume that same-sex marriage and same-sex behavior ought to be seen as morally neutral, sort of just like a category of people like Gentile or a category of person like eunuch. And eunuchs, as I noted before, they're highlighted because of some of the ways they show up in Scripture, and they're specifically noted as being a sexual minority, and that's why they're so important to this book. So because they assume that, for example, when Richard Hayes is dealing with Paul's instructions about the strong and the weak in Romans 14, he actually offers a very good overview of Paul's flow of thought, showing how that the Roman Christians are to handle differing opinions about dietary restrictions. And then, with no defense, no reasoning, no actual transition sentence, he simply says, the strong ones today are the liberated advocates of unconditional affirmation of same-sex unions. Now, equating same-sex relationships to matters of conscience like food and drink, as it is in Romans 14, that needs to be defended with sober reasoning and sound argumentation. And yet there's none. None in that chapter, none anywhere in the book. If he's going to dismiss the unanimous voice of the historic global church, there needs to be more than assertion and assumption. You can't just throw out what the church has always said with a wave of the hand. Ironically, when Richard is discussing the decrees of the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, one of which is abstaining from sexual immorality or sexual misconduct, Richard actually suggests that the church today should look at the Jerusalem Council there in Acts 15 as a pattern for discerning the will of God as things change. And he raises the possibility that if the church were to do that, if the church were to come together on this topic and submit to the Spirit and look at the scriptures, it might just decide that same-sex unions are no longer to be automatically classified as porneia, as sexual misconduct. And yet, ironically, the church has done that throughout history. And throughout the world today, it has spoken clearly and consistently on this subject. And my suggestion is that Richard Hayes should probably listen to the long-standing consensus of the church. Now, the second weakness of the book is just dismissive of the arguments. Not only do they offer assertion where we would expect argumentation, but they refuse to engage the conversation about the Bible's teaching on marriage and sexuality. They just dismiss the whole thing. Here's what they say as repetitive arguments about the same set of verses that are superficial and boring. You can find that on page 2 of the book. The debate about same-sex behavior from the scriptures, they say, should no longer focus on endlessly repeated exegetical arguments about a half dozen isolated texts. That's on page 206. My question would be, why not? Shouldn't we actually care what the text says? And the fact is, in addition to those texts that address that specific issue, there's the entire Bible's teaching that sex difference is an essential part to the meaning of marriage. Now, why did Christopher and Richard not revisit those passages that they just say are superficial and boring? Well, because they actually admit that they speak against their conclusion. On page 206, they say, it's relatively clear that these texts view homosexual sex negatively. But then they dismiss that fact simply by saying that the biblical authors didn't actually know what we know and have in mind what we have in mind as covenanted same-sex partnerships the way we know them today. The problem is that various scholars say that's incorrect. Recent scholarship has actually shown that there are examples of consensual same-sex partnerships and even marriages in the Greco-Roman world, the time period of the New Testament. So they refuse to engage the arguments, and they even seem ignorant of some of the most recent scholarship on the very subject that their book is addressing. That's a huge weakness. A third weakness is that Christopher's approach to the Old Testament is really a critical approach to the Old Testament. In the 7 chapters that he wrote on the Old Testament, Christopher clearly believes in the idea of source criticism. He believes that he can detect various sources even within the same books, not just throughout the Old Testament, but even within the very same books. So, for example, he says Exodus 22 was clearly written earlier than Exodus 13 and Exodus 34, and Exodus 13 and Exodus 34 are trying to correct what's said in Exodus 22. He just, again, assumes this idea of source criticism. So Christopher contends that some of the sources for the Old Testament come from later time periods in Israel's history, and that those later texts are actually challenging and correcting earlier texts, and they show us that God, as well as his people, are learning things and growing and changing their minds about things. And this isn't peripheral to his argument. This is actually central to his whole case. It's based on that idea that Christopher proposes that it's now time for us to move on from older versions of sexual morality and fully welcome same-sex couples into God's people today. And a fourth and final weakness of this book is Christopher offers a less than flattering, unbiblical view of God. In his chapters on the Old Testament, Christopher's portrayal of God is more akin to the God of open theism or the God of process theology. God, to Christopher, is a bit unsure of himself. He doesn't foresee and control everything, as Christopher says on page 86. The recurring image, Christopher says, of God throughout the Bible is that God is, quote unquote, learning on the job, page 48. And this, again, portrayal of God is central to his whole claim. God is figuring out what he really wants for people and what it really means for people to be his people as God goes along. God wants us, or Christopher wants us to believe that the story of the Bible is a story of a God who keeps learning over time, hey, mercy's better. And so he keeps expanding his mercy more and more and more. And now we can confidently believe that God has expanded his mercy to include same-sex unions. Now, the Bible never tells us this, of course, but Christopher says, even though that's the case, we should believe it because the trajectory of the Bible is in the direction of mercy. And so while Scripture does mention that God changes his mind, the way the Bible describes it is a far cry from the way Christopher describes it, right? Christopher has this picture of God who created humans, and then he's trying to figure out, like, man, what really matters to me? What do I really expect of people? Well, when the Bible talks about changing his mind, it usually has to do with God's response to humans changing their behavior. In fact, one passage that Christopher talks about in the book is Jeremiah 18, 7 through 10. It's a great example of the way God changing his mind actually works, and it doesn't support Chris's contention. Christopher summarizes it by saying that the prophet may announce judgment only to have God change his mind. And the implication is the poor prophet standing there, caught off guard, looking surprised. But that summary ignores what the text actually says. What Jeremiah 18, 7 through 10 says is that if God announces judgment against a nation, and then that nation repents, God reserves the right to change his mind and not exact judgment upon them. So you notice what the text actually says? There's a good reason why God changed his mind. The nation repented. And that actually shows not that God is learning that mercy is better. It actually shows that God is being consistent with his character and his purposes. He's not stumbling along trying to figure it out as he goes and finally coming to the conclusion that mercy is the best way forward. He's actually upholding his standards of wisdom and righteousness and judgment for his people. So essentially, in conclusion, the message of this book is that the Bible clearly speaks against same-sex unions. And even though that's the case, the church should see that now God is doing a new thing. God's changing his mind once again. So who are we to block God? Who are we to get in God's way? We should get on board with what God is doing, this new thing he's doing, and we should fully affirm same-sex unions. But the authors, both Christopher and Richard, simply assume they're right about that. They're simply assume that it's right to throw out what they acknowledge the Bible actually says, and they give no reason why the historic, global, multi-ethnic church's univocal understanding of same-sex behavior is actually wrong.